created in the image and likeness of God. We are, who is perfection, wholeness, goodness. There's something in us that is like that is God-like. But perfectionism is different from just having that sense of goodness, beauty, truth. Perfectionism takes two forms, I think. One is you're trying to be perfect all the time. You always want the best grades. You always want to be the most successful. You always want to be the most admired. And if you don't, you feel you failed, and the failure makes you despair or angers you or lowers your own self-estimation. You want always to look good in other people's eyes, but you also want to be the best at what you do. Religiously speaking, perfectionism is often expressed in an over dedication to keeping the rules. A certain type of religious person who thinks that the best way they can come closer to God and grow in their faith is to keep all the rules. And actually they like rules because it's very clear what they have to do to be perfect. In fact, they like lots of rules sometimes, and they like the rules to be strictly articulated and enforced, because then it's easy for them to be perfect. At least they know what they have to do to be perfect. Well, that's one kind of perfectionism that can lead to a very disturbed personality or a very scrupulous kind of religiosity. There's another kind of perfectionism which doesn't emphasize so much my being perfect, but projecting my sense of perfection outside of myself onto maybe it's clergy or religious or your political leader within a few weeks anyway of their election, or a partner, or a project that you're doing, a work that you are committed to. Your sense of perfection can be projected into that, and you satisfy your own need for perfection by association with that projection, whether it's a person or a project or whatever. Either way, it seems to me that perfectionism of that kind is idolatry. It isn't really worshipping God, but an idea of God or a projection of perfection. That's the danger of religious perfectionism. It actually ends up denying God. You know, religious people can be very ungodly. Spirituality is the corrective to religious perfectionism. In our culture, spirituality and religion have been polarized. A lot of people will say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. But it seems to me more and more that we can't really separate these two dimensions of our search for wholeness, our search for God. That the challenge to us, and the challenge that John Main understood deeply, and our community tries to continue to serve, is to bring spirituality and religion together again. But spirituality is the inherent corrective to religious distortion or perfectionism of that kind, because spirituality does not begin with the idea of perfection, but with the idea of self-acceptance. Just accept yourself as you are. And that sounds easy, and maybe even a bit self-indulgent, But actually, it's a great deal more difficult and a great deal more uncomfortable than perfectionism. Perfectionism is an easy response. Self-acceptance is what St. Benedict refers to as humility, the 12 steps of humility, and it is the basis of our work and our practice of meditation. One of the reasons I think that we find meditation difficult, despite the fact that it is so simple, is precisely because the minute you sit down to be still and to meditate, you are confronted with yourself as you are at that moment. And you're doing this very simple, childlike work of meditation, and you discover, to your horror, that you're not perfect at it. In fact, you're not very good at it at all. That you are distracted from the beginning to the end of the meditation session. I think that's why people give up. Now, the reason we usually give for giving up is time and too busy. But some of the busiest people I know who are doing extremely responsible jobs and raising a family and living an ordinary life, or an extraordinary life, an extraordinarily busy life, I know that they do make time to meditate. That's all different. Some people can handle time better than others. But I don't think it's time that is the reason that we find meditation difficult. It's the work of self-acceptance, which is the opposite of and the antidote to perfectionism. And the extraordinary thing is that we change as we accept ourselves. As we really do this work of accepting ourselves as we are, the work of humility, we actually grow or develop into a greater wholeness, an integration of the conflicts within ourselves takes place. The real and the ideal aspects of our minds come together, so we're no longer living with a sense of perpetual failure and self-rejection, but there's an acceptance of the fact that we're not perfect, but we're getting a little bit better each day, for example. So our humility in daily life. And we are no longer constructing an imaginary standard of happiness or perfection or the achievements that would make me acceptable and famous or lovable or popular. So in this work of self-acceptance that takes place in meditation, you could say the work of humility, we are moving beyond the whole trap of religious perfectionism. The spiritual tradition that we belong to describes several practices which help us to do this. And these practices also prepare us for crisis, when crisis happens, as it does. And it helps us to grow through the crisis. These are ways of prayer. And of course, we're conscious that there are many different ways of prayer. But there are two ways I would like to, or three actually, I'd like to just describe briefly in conclusion. Three practical ways, three spiritual practices that help us to do this work of self-acceptance and to find and remain centered in this still point even during a major crisis. And the first is a mindfulness of death. Not a very popular practice today, and maybe the reason that it has slipped out of popular Christian spirituality is because we think we've got enough death